Untitled Pastor at the Lord's New Church, and it is the 13th of August, 2021, at Freiburg. And I just want to start by saying thank you to everybody here. For the last 2 weeks, you have welcomed me and my family with tremendous love and graciousness, and we're very grateful. I know that we've all had a wonderful time, and there's too many people who have done so much work to even go through, but I just want to thank all of them, including Becky, who will be changing the slides for me. So this was a difficult thing to name because it covers quite a bit. I was going to name it a Cosmo-Psycho-Sociology of Love, but I didn't want to come across as too, what's the right word? Erudite or pretentious. I have to hide the pretentiousness. So I just changed it to a Theology of Love. And I'm actually really excited, more than any of the other presentations. I'm excited to show you this because to me this is really, it's sort of the heart of who I am. I do believe that theology is the leaves for the healing of the nation. The truths that we have been given in the Word heal us, and fill us with a desire to love, and that is heaven, that is joy. So I'm going to go through some of the major ideas that to me open my heart to feeling God's presence and therefore heaven and love. So obviously to really get there requires a lot of work, but to have a window open to inspire us to do the work is always nice. So without further ado, let's have the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to sort of organize it by a few premises. And this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but when I say loving others is a higher love than loving the Lord, and loving relationships with other people are more sacred than adoration of God, I say that because I believe that it is the purpose of reality, that we enter into loving relationships with others, and we'll go through that. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to go into some basic premises of theology. This is a quote from True Christian Religion 18. The one God is named I Am from his being. That is, from the fact that he alone is or exists, was and will be, because he is the first and the last, the beginning, the end, the Alpha and the Omega. God is love itself. So we have a singular reality, and that is God. God is love. So the only reality is what we're being told. The only reality is love. Okay, next slide, please. So in one sense, from one view of reality, there's just this God. And that's monism. There's nothing else, just God. But the problem with God being love isn't real unless there's something else. So it's a contradiction to say that there's only love, there's only God, when there must be something else for love to be real. So let's look at the next slide. Being is not possible without expression, for being exists through expression, not apart from it. And next slide, please. It's Divine Love and Wisdom 14. And another quote, God is reality itself. Everything that exists must come from that reality. To speak of creating something that exists from a nothing that does not exist is a plain contradiction of terms. So in other words, God is not going to be creating reality from anything that's outside of himself, God's own self. But it also says, what is created by God in God is not a continuation of him, since God is intrinsic reality, and there is no trace of intrinsic reality in anything created. So we're heading into a conundrum or a paradox. Next slide, please. So this isn't correct. It's not that God created some extension of himself, because that would just be God, continuation of God. But it's also that it's not that he created something that's not of himself also. So God alone is, so what is creation? It is not God, but it's also not God. So we're stuck. And I know this sounds pretty heady and sort of irrelevant to love, but when we get to the end, I promise this has everything to do with purpose and feeling love. So next slide. God is human, therefore a God having expression. Not having expression from himself, but in himself. He who has expression in himself is God, from whom all things spring. So creation, his expression, is somehow in himself, but not himself. So we're getting a little closer. Next slide, please. Why don't you click that link and let's hope it works. I might have to watch an ad.
That face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance.
Looks like we can skip
that
it
face
now.
wouldn't be doing that if you weren't.
All right, wonderful. This is an MRI scan going piece by piece through the human brain, slice by slice. And you can see patterns sort of evolving and fading as the MRI goes deeper through the brain and then out the other side. And to me, this is a very good analogy for what creation is. Thank you. You can just leave it like that, or go to the next slide, I guess.
I want to see it again.
Some people want to see it again, Becky, if you can return. So think of the skull and the brain as God. That's God. That's all that is. But we are traveling. You can think of our minds as limitations of consciousness. And time and space, the experience of time and space is sort of like traveling through God, just as those slices are traveling through a picture of the brain. So it's only God, but from our experience of what is God, reality, it looks like there's a progression. It looks like things are not God. And we might even be able to see patterns forming and disappearing, and we can say, oh, okay, I understand about the past, so I can predict the future. And we might get a little bit right, but it's not really causal in the way we think it is. It's not that the past is causing the future. It's that we are in God, experiencing God, and God contains inherently pattern. So God is timeless, just like there's no movement of the brain. But we are going through an experience of God that creates the illusion of time. So again, I know this is pretty heady, but it is relevant. Because there are infinite elements in the human God, notice it says in, which appear in heaven, in angels, and in people as in a mirror. And because the human God does not exist in space, it can be seen and comprehended to some extent how God can be omnipresent, omniscient, and all-providing, and how as a person he could create all things and can, as a person, hold all things created by him in their proper order to eternity. So I think that this idea of what reality is satisfies all the things we're told about God and about creation. There is only God. He doesn't create anything outside of himself, and he doesn't create an extension of himself. But we can have an experience of reality as an independent being because of our limitations. Our ignorance is what sustains our sense of being, of personhood. So being ignorant and having these tremendous limitations is actually the greatest gift that we've been given, because it allows us to be alive as if ourselves. Next number. The universe, being an image of God, and therefore full of God, could be created by God only in God. God is reality itself, and everything that exists must come from that reality. To speak of creating something that exists from a nothing that does not exist is a plain contradiction of terms. Still, what is created by God in God is not a continuation of him, since God is intrinsic reality, and there is no trace of intrinsic reality in anything. Okay, created. Next number, please, or next slide. But we still have this problem. God can't have a direct relationship with us. This is what Ian was talking about. Love and truth are God, and the love and truth that is in any one of us, any one of you, that is God's alone. That is God, right? So God can't love God. That's selfish. And if he created us just so that he could satisfy that he have a loving relationship, that also is a form of selfishness, right? Especially when we think that it includes the opportunity for some people to go to eternal hell. That just can't be true, right? It cannot be true that God creates us so that he can have relationship, knowing that that will give the reality that some people go to hell. And also the power difference between a creator and a created is so infinitely vast, you can't talk about it, there's no ratio, that it's wrong. You can't have a direct relationship between creator and creation that is meaningful. It's not a mutual love. So let's look at the next slide. So how can God's love actually be realized? God has created us as a limited experience and expression, the cross-section of the brain, of the divine being, so that we can interact with love with one another. And that's the only real meaningful place of love in our experiences. When we do this, then divine love, for the first time, actually finds expression. Each instance of love between a finite human being and another finite human being is unique and is actual. It's an actual expression of divine love that is outside of the divine. So when two limited minds receive divine love, from the divine perspective, there's nothing new created because he already knows that love. But when these two limited experiences of reality love one another, well, that's something new. That's something precious. That's creation. That, to me, in my mind, is the first moment of actual creation. So that's why, next slide. And that's why these things now come into a new meaning in this idea. The life of divine love is the essence of charity. What is divine love? Ultimately, it's charity, because that's the only place it's found true expression. And then the new commandment shows that these two things become one. Love others as I have loved you. That's the whole purpose of God, that we love each other. And TCR 457, maybe my favorite number in the whole writings, talks about how God loves people but can't love us directly for the reasons I showed. In my mind, that's why. And therefore, he breathes his love into us so that we can love one another. That's what that number says. And when we do that, it goes on, that's when we're linked to God. That is the link to God. So all of that heady stuff really is relevant to our actual living. We exist so that God's love can find true expression for the first time when we love one another. That's pretty amazing. Next number, or next slide. So I hope that you, like I do, when you think about that, feel a little rush of love. Like, it is exciting to be alive, and it's exciting to have the opportunity to bring God into reality in our consciousness, and that's a creation. That's a real thing. Next. Now we're going to move on to another idea, that we can see what I've been talking about present throughout the entire universe. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going into a pretty big risk here talking about stuff that I don't really know much about when there's a nuclear physicist in the audience. So Ian, feel free to reprimand me as I make any mistakes. So in the so-called beginning of time, which also doesn't really make sense when you think carefully about it, but I won't go into that, because of the nature of God, creation has always been, and that'll be present in the very last slide. But in the vision that we have been given, that limitation, there is a sort of beginning of reality, the universe. And there was a sea of quarks. But when they immediately get together into what are called hadrons, the main two of which are protons and neutrons, and a quark's gravity or mass is minuscule, like nothing basically. But when they get together, suddenly the mass that they produce is magically 100 or more times than the sum of the parts. So something real is being created that just didn't exist. It becomes real when they join together into a unity. So when things get together, there's three of them. When they get together in a unity, something new called mass is produced. It's a new reality. When protons and electrons get together, suddenly there's something called an atom, and space or physicality, couldn't find the right word for it, is created because think of a proton as the size of a dime, and when it's tiny, but when it gets an electron spinning around it, now that entity is the size of a football field. So suddenly, and you can interact with it now physically. It will stop you. But can you imagine trying to hit a dime? Very difficult. So now there's this new thing, space or physicality. When an atom meets another atom, then you get the next element, helium, which that's just a sum of the parts, but you have fusion energy. So suddenly there's this other new reality, which is an incredible amount of thermo energy that wasn't there before. Something new, again, is created. And then when this happens enough, you get a supernova, it explodes, and out come all the elements of the chemical chart. Again, something entirely new that didn't exist. When these get together, you get molecules, an infinite variety, of substances that you didn't have before. And then this is like, as I think it was Fred Hoyle, said, this step, it's like a cake, all the ingredients of a cake in your kitchen, jumping into the pan, stirring themselves together, sticking themselves in the oven, and coming out as a cake, all by themselves. Somehow, lifeless molecules get together and become a cell. And the cell has life, something entirely new. And it can reproduce, which is also something entirely new. This is extraordinary. That step is just mind-bending. It doesn't make sense scientifically. But again, you see the same pattern, things coming together and something entirely new coming into being. Same thing with this. Did you know that our cells really only can function as they do because there's a foreign entity inside of them called mitochondria? The plants have something similar. So we have internal symbiosis to create life as we know it. And this kind of symbiosis is also something new. These things are interdependent, right? Plants and animals. It's all woven together. Finally, this other new thing comes into existence, human mind, which can think on a level that is way beyond It's not just thinking. It is an awareness that transcends animal awareness, and infinitely. We can't really compare the two. It's a totally different thing. And that can receive God. And when two of these mind-heart entities, which we are, go into a relationship that includes love, then God is born into the world. Another entirely new thing. So this, next slide, please. This, in my mind, is a pattern of patterns, and it is the description. It's God telling us who he is throughout the entire universe, and it can only exist because we have limited consciousness. And it's an ever-opening revelation, like a flower that just keeps opening and opening, revealing God. Next slide. So less meaningful, less real entities surrendering selfhood by joining together with others to create something more elegant, beautiful, and meaningful and real than the parts. That's a good description of love, isn't it? That we surrender ourselves to join into community with others to become something better than the sum of our parts. And it can't be said that these parts are creating this new reality because they don't have it within them. It is receiving some kind of new life, some kind of new dimension, some kind of new expression of God. And we're given to participate in this new thing as if it was ours, even though it is coming from somewhere beyond ourselves. Next slide, please. And I believe that just as this evolution throughout the universe happened, it's inevitable that the human race is going to follow this pattern. We are in the process of figuring out how to join together to create something much, much more wonderful than ourselves. A beautiful society of love. I think it's inevitable, because that's what we've seen, and that's what God is promising also. Now that fills me with love, to not have to worry. This is happening. It will happen. And we get to participate in this as if we are doing it. Next slide, please. So I hope you get to feel that too. The whole universe is the revelation of God's love, and we are the cutting-edge participants at this point. Who knows what's going to come next? Next slide, please. All right, premise 3. God is more loving than he lets on. Okay, so there's an unnoticed paradox. I took this from Gard. Hidden in plain view in the writings, and the resolution is also hidden in plain view. But we'll get through it. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, we have this message in the writings. And if you want to really get the conflict between these, read Divine Providence and mark as each of these premises are stated. Based on human volition and choice, people go either to heaven or hell. Right? You read that plenty of times in plenty of ways throughout the writings. On the other hand, we also read this plenty of times, that a human being is born evil, ignorant, and plunging into evil, that we have zero power to propel ourselves even an iota towards God, and that God is the all in all of repentance, reformation, and regeneration. People just read through and don't seem to notice that there's a problem here. These cannot coexist. It does not make sense. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a deep, more wordy explanation of some of the things I just said. We'll go on, because the real point of this is, next slide, please. So again, sort of the problem with just thinking in this way is that it's inevitable that if we think we're going to heaven, we'll think, I deserve this because I made some good choices, right? I have earned heaven. You cannot help but start thinking that way. Those in hell, they deserve it because they didn't make the good choices. We've just made ourselves God, right? We're saying our fate is determined not by God, but by the self. But we know the self cannot move forward towards God. On the other hand, if God is doing it all, we fall into some other traps. Predestination. God decides some go to heaven, some goes to hell. That's not a very good God. Why should I bother doing anything? God's the only doer. I'll just chill, drink lots of beers, and hope for the best. And ultimately, you end up realizing life's meaningless. What's the point? So let's see if there's a resolution of a paradox. Next slide, please. So there is a resolution, and it's also in plain sight. If we engage in the work of repentance and regeneration as if of self, right? That phrase is always there. We go to heaven. If we do not, we go to hell. Based on personal choice and freedom, people go either to eternal hell or eternal heaven. Freedom and choice are the same as love, and love is God. So these two phrases, which are included in this idea, really are connected to this thought that God is the all in all. We have to do the work, but it's as if of self. And what's really doing it is love, and that love is God. Now, we might say, well, what about human freedom? Does that mean we're just robots, we're not doing anything, we're just being animated as if? No, because love is freedom itself. Next slide, please. So the more God enters into our lives, the freer we become. Freedom that we usually think about is actually slavery, right? Our freedom to do what we want from our sense of self, that's slavery. Because we're driven mechanically, because that part of us is of the mechanical universe with the mechanical laws. We seek what we want for ourselves. But real spiritual freedom is to receive love and to feel love and to therefore want to enact love. So the more God draws us up, evolves us into a state of receiving love, the more free we actually become. We're becoming alive, not robots. Because love isn't limited. I can love anybody no matter what they do to me, right? I have no barriers if I'm in a state of love. Just like Jesus on the cross said, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Next slide, please. So what are we? Like I said, we're a set of limitations. We are a jumble, and this is just a few of everything that comprises what we are to make us unique. We have our environment, our genetics, the love we've experienced or not received as a child and as an adult, all the family dynamics we experienced, the order of childbirth we fall in, everything that a family involves, any traumas that we have had, any spiritual education that we've been blessed to have, if it's right or cursed to have, if it's going to do bad things to how we think and act, the natural education that we get in schools, the culture that we're embedded in. One wonderful thing about going to Nepal for me was to realize that my culture sustained who I was. I really ended up thinking, I have no idea who I am anymore, which was a really hard thing to feel. But it woke me up to realize, wow, what I consider myself is not really myself. I am being held in by all these forces to have a sense of self. Next slide. So when we start to decide who's worthy of our love or not, we're really, really in a deep delusion. A delusion that we can understand someone when they are such a complex mix of everything they've ever experienced. So you are there in the center. You are here as a unique formulation of limitations, consequent delusions, and consequent evil desires. That's pretty much what the writings say a human being is of itself. Thereby, you are a unique portal for the reification of divine love, a unique gem refracting the light of God in a unique way, just like everyone else. Think of this room. Everybody is shining their love, their God's love, God's light, in a completely special way. And when all of this, when it all meets together, you see God in a vivid and new way. That is beautiful. Next slide, please. The Lord is waking us up as to our particular formulation of limitations allows, and to the extent that one is awake, one becomes an agent of that same effort of divine love. We start to be a part of the solution. We start to spread that good news, that love towards other people, and we become an active force as if of self. We're given to feel like, wow, this is what I want to do. And we are alive in it. And we're helping that purpose. The waking occurs only through our experience, our as if, of decision, agency, and action. Nevertheless, none of these can be attributed to anyone but God. We cannot take credit for any good thing we've ever done. We just cannot do it. And yet we get to feel like it's us, and we have to take the action. God's working through us, through our feeling of selfhood, and that selfhood deciding to do something. Next slide, please. So then we get to the question, well, if this is how it works, if God is doing everything and we're experiencing it through an as if of self, through a set of limitations of our awareness of God, then how does hell fit into this? Is God sending people to hell and some people to heaven? Did some people's circumstances disallow them from making it? Oh, too bad, we couldn't evolve you. Here's your spot over here. Watch out for the fire and the pitchforks. Well, this is where the paradox gets stuck in a way. So, next slide, please. This is my belief that the last judgment, next slide, please. I don't know why the word you isn't there. There. The last judgment where heaven and hell is divided is something that occurs within each individual. There are devils of my past, right? There are devils of my thought and my mind and my heart, right? They are there, and I can't erase them. They need a place to be pushed away from what God is preparing inside of me to be his vessel. So there is a hell, and that hell is eternal, and it is filled with spirits. Spirits are described as embodiments of affections. They are described as embodiments of affections. So all my negative affections, my selfishness, they are real, they exist, they have an effect in the world when I have acted on them, and they have an effect on myself when they are there, and they don't disappear. They're not magically erased. So they need a place. So the Lord comes into our hearts. He subjugates the hells. That is, when truth and experiences of love come into our lives, that is God, and that changes the way we think and feel, forcing those evil desires, selfishness, to be subjugated. And he reorders the heavens, which is our thought and our heart. This is from the writing. God came into the world to subjugate the hells and reorder the heavens and save the human race. Right? That's what the Lord did. That's from the writings. And the reordering of the heavens is a reordering of how we think and feel into a state of love and save the human race. Well, that's what saves us. Next slide. Therefore, putting it all together, we are drops within the sacred river of providence, borne along by a force, not ourselves, divine love. But what is a river without the drops? And which drop is more important than another? And is the river more important or the drops? You sure about? Well, what is a river without the drops? The drops, the river. Yeah, they are one. It is one. In other words, and then the next is gravity more important than the water to create the river? These are unanswerable questions, right? And that's. There you go. Next slide, please. So is God or us, the recipient beings, more important? It's the same question. Are the drops of the river more important? You can't answer that question. Human beings are a part of God, of God's plan. But we get to experience the separation, which is our life. Next slide, please. So being is not, this is a quote, right? And I bring it now because of what I said sort of will help make sense of this. Being is not being, and we're talking about God here. God is being itself, the only being. God is not unless God has expression. God does not exist unless God has expression. Expression is united with God by virtue of the fact that it is an expression of God. The consequent effect is a union into one, and so it is. And when I say expression, I'm talking about us, creation, right? We are creation is the expression of God. The consequent effect is a union into one, and so it is that each mutually and reciprocally is the complement of the other, and that each is the all in all things of the other as it is in itself. God cannot exist without creation, and creation cannot exist without God. I'm not saying that we are many gods and that the divine, we can walk around saying, I'm God. I'm just saying that without us as a recipient being to experience love and give it to one another, there is no God. Because God must have expression. Love must have expression to be love. So, next slide, please. I hope that you feel a little rush of love in this theology. The reason I love this theology is because it does, to me, explain what we are, who God is, what our purpose is, and it is all about love. Love is, in the end, the only thing that exists. So, thank you very much.
Hi, this is Dave Keating.
Hi, David.
I was getting ready for this question early in the lecture, but your quotation from DLW 15 certainly was appropriate because it talked about union with God. But in the beginning you said we cannot have direct union with God, and I'm thinking the word direct is important. But after Ian's lecture on Monday, and when I mentioned that we can have union with God and he disagreed, I went to DT Search and wrote down 3 quotations from Swedenborg. And one of them is especially appropriate from what you've been talking about, loving the neighbor. And I'd like you to expand more on what you mean by direct and tell me what you think about this from Swedenborg. The important word is, the Latin is conjunctionum, which the earlier translators that loved Latinism translated as conjunction. But George Dole used more modern English, and this is a perfectly acceptable translation of conjunctio, is union.
Yeah, I like union.
And from Divine Providence 94, the Lord's union with us and our mutual union with the Lord are accomplished through our loving our neighbor as ourselves and loving the Lord above all. Mm-hmm. So I didn't specify what kind of union I meant when I said we can have union with God or be one with God. And perhaps Ian thought I was saying what you meant by direct union. And there seems to be different kinds of union, as you even quoted from DLW.
Yeah.
So can you comment on what you meant by direct and on this passage?
Sure. If we try to have direct union with God, then one result would be we disappear, right? If we actually achieve that, then the selfhood is gone, all limitations disappear, and then there's no relationship anymore because we've lost our selfhood, right? Our sense of selfhood. So that's one thing. And there are quotes, including 457, about unity with God. And that, as far as I know, like yours and 457, it says it's achieved by charity. It's achieved by love between human beings.
But it says union,
Yeah.
and it doesn't specify, so it seems that you have to be specific about what type of union you're talking about.
I think it's a union of will, right? Because God loves people, that's his love. That is what he is. He is a love for us. So if I have a love for others, then I have a unity of will with God. And it will start to arrange my thoughts in ways that start to approximate wisdom, the infinite wisdom of God, but a very small approximation of it.
A small union, like rather than if we try to have a big union, we disappear. But we can make
a unity of heart,
right.
right? Just like a husband and wife or spouses can have a kind of a unity of heart, right? So that's when we love one another, we can start to have a unity of heart with God because his love is for us too. Okay, I'm not going to moderate who goes when, so... All right, Herb.
Okay, I'll let the audience moderate.
I just wanted to thank you, Kent, for what for me was a really clear explanation and exposition of some things that I have difficulty with in reading Swedenborg's writings. And you made much of it very clear to me, and your slides were great. They helped with the clarity, and I just wanted to thank you for that. One comment or question I have is, I always have this notion when I try to simplify what Swedenborg is saying. I always thought he was saying, our purpose here is to love God, and since we can't feel or know or experience direct union with him, we love him by loving the neighbor, and we love the neighbor by being of use. That's my simple explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me that sounds like loving God's above loving the neighbor. The purpose of being here is loving God, not loving the neighbor. So it's just a little problem for me.
Yeah, I feel that loving God is ultimately so we can love our neighbor. This is theology, right? It's sort of the science of God. I love it because it makes me grateful, which is a good feeling, but it inspires me to love others, and I think that's what it's there for. God gives the books because he wants us to love each other, because sort of going back to what David said, God loving his own creation cannot be a fulfillment of his desire. If I make something and wow, what an awesome painting that is, right? That's self-love. But if that painting loves another painting, then I can love that because it's not me anymore, right? God, when two people love each other, that's what God can love because it's unique and of them. Does that help? Oh, and I wanted to say one more thing. When on top of the ark, the cherubim, the wings meet. One represents love of the Lord, the other represents love of the neighbor. the voice of Jehovah, or I am, comes to Moses through that place. And what that represents is ultimately love of the neighbor and love of the Lord is not differentiated. It's one thing. That's where we start to feel inspiration, I'd say. Guard.
Okay, you got a lot of hands. So I'm just gonna. So and we have a moderator who's naming the people who are coming. That's great. I just want to. I also want to echo what Herb said. This doesn't amplify this. I want to. It's all new. Everything is new. I want to echo what Herb said. I thank you very much. Your explanation was very clear and comprehensive in a way that was very original. I'd like to see it in a book. Use your slideshow and just put it in a book. Thank you very much. I also want to thank you for a couple of insights I had, which was this love of one person for another creates something new in a way for the first time, in a way that is original and that God can then celebrate or feel or be aware of. And that was totally original. I really appreciate that. Maybe one comment then on the word limitation. It sounds a little bit like boundaries to me, and I also appreciate that. And then finally, your insight as to the microcosm of the judgment is wonderful. That needs to be uplifted as well. That the hells exist within an individual, and you explained it in such a unique way. Can't get over that. And of course, the Latin word there is to remove evil, which actually simply means to send it to the periphery, and it never goes away. Actually, that is our boundary.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting way to look at this. I won't go into that further because there are a lot of hands. Oh my goodness.
I talked a long time.
I'm going to ask you, you're going to be talking again, so I'll catch you on the flip flop.
All right, it's a totally different topic, so might as
I
well
said no.
might as well speak now.
Oh, okay, we just grabbed it. Sandy's up. We have one time for one more comment.
Last question.
Put the microphone to your face.
In a very, Herb's comments were excellent. In a way that I can say anything is neighbors have to qualify. We can't unconditionally throw ourselves at our neighbors, and or we won't have anything left in ourselves, and they will return with their own vice. But as far as our human destiny, it is our destiny, if we can fulfill it, to return to the immortal state from this mortal state, which is pummeled with temptations to be full of self-love. It comes at us like hail, and we have to know that that is a truth, a given, and we are intending to return to the immortal state.
Thank you, Sandy.
This is Susanna, and if I could just say one last thing, is that we often talk about the free will that comes into our intentions, and that's from God's love. We have God's wisdom coming out into our minds and our understanding, but we have another gift, and it helps me a lot with that act as if. We have the privacy of our own minds to go through this in this life in a way that we don't in the next life. So consider that a gift, that you're allowed to have your own process of regeneration inside of you, and nobody else has to know what you're going through. But that's the acting, for me, that's the acting as if. It's like, I know it's not me. I'm going to do this quietly in my head until I am at a better place where I want people to see me. And in the next world, we will see each other quite deeply. So
Thank you, Susanna.
we're at...
Online question
okay.
from Jesse to everyone. I agree, Kent. You made things much more clear to me, especially the concept of heaven and hell. Thank you.
And
My pleasure.
And thank you, Kent. We're at time, and we will be back in 10 minutes to hear more from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.